Hello everyone and welcome back to the Better Policy Project's YouTube channel. We are thrilled to bring you some exciting updates. First, we have a fascinating presentation by Michael Kiley from the Federal Reserve, where he delves into an analysis of recession prediction using multiple indicators. The term spread emerged as the most reliable predictor of recessions within a one-year horizon, while the unemployment rate and inflation also showed promise for medium to long-term predictions. By considering those indicators collectively, the accuracy of recession forecasts was significantly improved, emphasizing the importance of multifaceted approach to economic forecasting. You can find the link to this insightful video in the description. In addition, we recently hosted a seminar in collaboration with the Global Forecasting School, featuring two parts. In the first part, Moritz Pfeiffer and Vincent Marhol presented their research on the application of large language models, or LLMs, to analyze central bank communications. Their work resulted in the development of Central Bank Roberta, an economic agent classifier capable of identifying the roles of 5 macroeconomic agents, including households, firms, the financial sector, governments, and central banks themselves. Furthermore, they developed a binary sentiment classifier to determine the emotional content of sentences within the central bank communications. During the second part of the seminar, Haik Karapetyan from the Global Forecasting School presented Case A and Case B scenarios from the latest editions of the Not the Fed Tealbook. To make the content even more accessible, 2 versions of the Not the Fed Tealbook will be available. FPAS Mark 1/2 with consensus seeking and FPAS Mark II with individual accountability. Stay updated with our ongoing research by visiting the Better Policy Project's website. You will find the link in the description of this video.
All right, so again, thanks Douglas, thanks Asya for having us. We're really excited. This is the first presentation on this model, Central Bank Roberta, which Vincent and I have been working on almost for a year. It was quite a journey, so we're happy to present it today. Yeah, I will start right away just to save time. What was our motivation for this paper? Obviously, central bank communications have become an increasingly important tool of monetary policy to manage expectations. Communications also enhance legitimacy and increase monetary policy effectiveness. We, Vincent and I, have been working on central bank communications before this already, and sort of, for us, there are basically two big problems in central bank communications in general. One of the biggest problems is that studies do not account for heterogeneity of central bank audiences. So in most papers, it is often assumed that the central banker is speaking to markets and markets only, and there's no distinction or definition of what the market actually is. So no distinction is being made with whom the central bank is actually communicating, which is kind of a pity because communication is all about communicating to somebody, right? So this is like a big problem. And the second problem we discovered was that linguistic tools that are being used in quantifying communications are often very reduced or very limited. They while they can quantify syntax, they are unable to quantify semantics. So they are not sensitive to actually knowing what a sentence means, which is also quite problematic. One solution to this problem we have found is that large language models or state-of-the-art algorithms that have advanced recently, right, with ChatGPT, we are all secretly using it. So these kind of tools and techniques might be more helpful in solving these two problems of audiences on the one hand, distinguishing between audiences, and on understanding semantic context. So we believe that these kind of models can help us solve these two problems. So for this, we have constructed a new data set of 28,518 labeled sentences. So we will explain later what this means. Based on speeches that are archived or being kept on the website of the Fed, the BIS, and the ECB. We construct a two-stage fine-tuned large language model, which is based on Meta's Roberta architecture, and we call it Central Bank Roberta. So the first stage in this model allows to discriminate for economic agents in the economy, households, firms, the financial sector, and the government. So this is really sort of basic economics, right? The economy consists of different agents. We don't go into like super crazy specifics here, but we just decide to focus on four. And then the second stage is to actually discriminate between whether a given sentence is is positive or negative. So if the sentiment that is in that sentence is positive or negative. As somebody, I think it would be great if I hear some background noise. So if you could just mute, that would be great. And then we, to test the accuracy of our model, we fine-tune other NLP models as well, including both deep learning and conventional machine learning algorithms, which then act as benchmarks for our method. And our results are that our model outperforms the other NLP techniques in our benchmarks. The model also offers unprecedented data coverage and is the first to discriminate audiences. So we demonstrate then some descriptive and econometric applications for the model. So this, I think, might be actually more interesting for you to see how the model actually can be used, what it can do. The model and the training data will be released on GitHub and Hugging Face upon publication. So our goal is to work open access, open source, and to make it as easy to use as possible. So we will hopefully develop some kind of interface which makes it more easy to actually use the model, even if you don't know how to code. And so just an example from this morning, we were actually trying to find an example of Armenia, but the speeches are sadly not on the BIS. So we opted for a speech given this morning by Fed Chairman Jerome H. Powell at the Bank of Spain today in Madrid. And one of the sentences in the speech is, we also use our liquidity tools to make funding available to banks that might need it. So we just fed this sentence into our audience classifier, and our audience classifier correctly determined that the sentence addresses the financial sector. Good for our model. And then we want to know, hey, is the sentence actually positive or negative? And here again, our model predicts that the sentiment is positive. So the probability of the sentence being positive outweighs it being negative. So just to demonstrate here as an introduction quickly that even if we finished doing the model a couple of months ago, it still appears to work. So some details on the nature of central bank communications. So if you have a speech here again by Jerome Powell, where he says with vaccinations rising, schools reopening, and enhanced unemployment benefits ending, some factors that might be holding back job seekers are likely fading. Business and consumers widely report upward pressures on prices and wages. So the problem with such a sentence is that obviously the context will determine whether the sentence is positive or negative, right? So if he says enhanced unemployment benefits, but we understand unemployment benefits ending, only then we have opposite meaning. And most techniques that quantify sentences are not sensitive towards these kind of contexts. So in this case, the classical approach would just take both and they would carry opposite meanings. And then there's also the problem of audience specificity, right? So for example, upward pressure on wages is negative for business, but positive for households. So whether this sentence then is positive or negative highly depends on what kind of economic agent you are, or whether you are listening at all. So yeah, so basically, right, there's some linguistic idea behind all this, which then also flows into communication as a monetary policy tool. So central bank communications aim to establish public trust and increase monetary policy effectiveness. So Keynes, I think, said this quite well, right? That it's easy to control the short-term rate of interest. But the challenge really of monetary policy lies in guiding market actors' investment and consumption decisions. And this today is the different tools, but communications being part of them. The big problem here is that trust and effectiveness can also frequently be contradictory. So for example, Odyssean forward guidance may enhance potency but risk credibility, which makes communication very complex, also very coded and implicit. So determining actually or tiering meaning out of these sentences is also highly specific of the epistemic community of central bankers. If you run these very simple Flesch-Kincaid scores over Fed speeches, then the Flesch-Kincaid tells us that you actually need a college degree to understand them. By nature, central bank communications are also targeted. Market actors often have conflicting interests. Good news for one economic agent may be bad news for the other. So a simple positive-negative distinction might fail to capture the nuances of these sentiments. Yeah, for linguists, this is all no news. So we just put here a reminder of Wittgenstein. In most cases, the meaning of a word is its use, right? So context is key. In the literature, most sentiment is understood as a predictor of market events. So oftentimes then this hawkish dovishness distinction is extrapolated onto the positive negative framework. However, the literature only uses dictionary methods. So what does that mean? In these dictionaries, you have a set of n-grams, so either single words or a combination of several words, which are then predefined as being positive or negative or hawkish and dovish, and then calculated as the relative share of positive versus negative terms. This is obviously an approach that is interpretable for humans, but again, is context and audience blind, right? So for example, pressure on wages will flag both downward and upward pressure and does not distinguish between audiences. Another disadvantage of this kind of approach is that you actually lose a lot of data because you might not pre-classify all of your n-grams might not be found in your documents exactly in the same way as you classified them. So for example, in a paper I wrote before, we had the trigram relatively high unemployment, but in our PET data set of thousands of speeches, this trigram only occurred 11 times. So you need to multiply these trigrams, which is very cost intensive. Then accuracy can only be determined through manual verification of random sampling. No study has reported that the accuracy score of its n-grams. And this point is actually super important because it's very interesting that in the economic literature, the economists tend to report more on the accuracy of their econometric models, but not so much on the accuracy of their linguistic models. One way would be to random sample, but very few studies actually do that. Another approach that has gained some more popularity, especially in recent years, is topic modeling. So here people use like LDA or TF-IDF to create vector space representations of documents, which are then, for example, compared via cosine similarity or other similarity measures. Again, the problem of these kind of models is that they are not immediately interpretable and their accuracy cannot be verified. So it's up to the modeler to decide which topics make sense, how many topics there are, and so on. All these decisions have to be made sort of in advance or then interpreted onto the model. One example of this is a paper by Sanner and Baumgärtner where they use Draghi's whatever it's take speech and compare it to other speeches. Then there are word embedding techniques such as word2vec or GLOVE, which are also context blind. So topic models grouping terms such as CPI, interface, or prices are again insensitive to sentiment. So we don't know whether the price will rise, will fall, for whom, and so on. So the data-driven approach does not allow for comparison between datasets, as groupings will vary based on documents available. So if we take those shortcomings together, Vincent and I find, that there's a real gap actually for interpretable context and audience-sensitive natural language processing techniques. That's why we decided to go and see whether large language models can actually help. And the current state of the art in this field is Google's bidirectional encoder representations from transformers, or AKA BERT. And BERT uses context-sensitive bidirectional representations of words. So without context, the word representation, for example, of the word of the sentence bank of the river and bank account would be equal, but the bidirectional context can distinguish between I access B and I access B blah 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 account. So BERT can capture context better than previous NLP techniques. So these transformer models are techniques that actually mimic real neural networks. They capture long-range dependencies and therefore perform well for natural language. The recent application of ChatGPT is one example. The pre-training infrastructure of BERT also allows for task-specific fine-tuning with smaller data sets. So you can train these models on different data sets and fine-tune them to perform multiple tasks. In finance, this has already been done. So there are some papers that use these kind of large language models to predict stock price volatility and so on. In the field of central bank communications, this has not yet been done. So, hey Bert, here we are to try. So yeah, so BERT, again, novel approach using bidirectional encoders. BERT is trained on Wikipedia and Google Books. And Roberta is basically a modified version of BERT, which removes some features to make it more task specific. It also increased the training data by 100. So we fine-tuned our data set with Roberta, but we also tried BERT, but Roberta outperformed BERT. So we have two models, one that distinguishes sentiment, positive and negative, and one that discriminates audiences, where audiences, again, are understood as basic economic agents, the households, firms, financial sector, and the government. And we actually, for the agent classifier, have also included a self-referential classifier that can tell or detect when the central bank talks about itself, which happens quite frequently. So here you can see a bit how our data set is structured. So we used the databases of the Fed, the ECB, and the BIS using different web scraping techniques. The ECB is the only central bank that actually publishes its speeches in a ready-made data frame since I don't know when this happened, like 2018 or something. And the Fed has the kind of additional challenge that it also has district banks. So we also collected all the speeches of the different district banks. And then the BIS has speeches from central banks from all over the world. So why did we do this? Because, again, central bank communication is very coded, and the more central banks you include and the more context specific these codes become, also on like a national level, probably the more accurate will be our model. And we did the same for sentiment. Yeah, so we have these three data sets for both classification tasks. So what did we do? We manually labeled 12,888 randomly sampled sentences from the Fed speeches from 1984 to 2022. And then we added through pseudo labeling another 28,518 sentences to include the other central banks. So pseudo labeling, it's basically a technique. Once you can be fairly certain that your labeling is correct, you apply it to another data set, and then you include the pseudo labels into your data set. So 6,205 sentences are manually labeled to speak either about financial sector, household, firms, the central bank, and the government. Among those sentences attributed to an audience, we attribute 6,683 sentences, a positive and a negative label. And here it's important that we understand positive or negative sentiment only in relation to the identified economic agent. So yeah, we don't understand it as representing some kind of specific monetary policy, such as hawkishness or dovishness, stance such as hawkishness or dovishness. For the sentiments, we excluded statements about the central bank itself because tests have just shown that most of the time they are fairly neutral. So here's just an example of how we went about. So we had this basically spreadsheet which with these thousands of sentences, and then we labeled them according to whether they are positive or negative and according to the audience. So here, for example, we have Michael Moscow saying, on a very practical level, we reestablish our competitiveness in financial services. So here, this is clearly positive for the financial sector. Then Robert Forrestal here in the next sentence says, continued success on the economic front depends largely on political reform, namely constitutional reforms that will help restrain fiscal spending. So here clearly it's a communication towards the government, which is negative. And in the last example, our homeowners are thus less burdened with their housing predicament and better positioned as consumers. Richard Pitcher here addressing households in a positive way. Okay, I need to finish. I need to hurry up. Okay, so then we trained our model, and we have the following results. So on the top here, you can see. On the top, you can see the results for our agent classifier against BERT and XLNet. So XLNet being another large language model. And we can see that Roberta is similar, but slightly better than both. So we benchmark the performance of central bank Roberta by fine-tuning other NLP methods with our data. For the sentiment classifier, we have also included some more traditional machine learning algorithms and deep learning algorithms, and also find that in the end, Roberta outperforms them all. So what are the advantages of this model? Central bank Roberta significantly increases data coverage compared to other methods. This is what I said before, that here we actually can amass data on a sentence level. So this makes the analysis a much more granular than using, for example, n-grams, which then again would also have advantages for econometric modeling. So here we just want to show you quickly what are the uses of this model or what it can do. So we labeled, or we let the model label our Fed data set, in the entire Fed data set, to see, okay, whom does the Fed address? Is the Fed speaking more positively, and so on? And here we have some results coming from the application of our model. So it's interesting here, to see that the Fed actually speaks most to the financial sector, and then about itself. So there's a lot of self-referentiality here and a lot of communications to the market. So by the end of the day, it might not be that far-fetched to understand the market as the major audience of the central bank. Nevertheless, there are also firms and households and a tiny fraction of the government. So the government apparently comes last. We can check over time just whether the speeches are more positive or negative. We observe, and this is a finding obviously that corresponds with the other literature, that communications have increased on average. However, we observe that the communications are also more negative on average than positive. Here we can see the sentiment by audience, and again, most of these are in the negatives. Nevertheless, we can see that in recent years, for example, the sentiment towards the government has somewhat increased or is still in the negative, but less so. And we can also see some cycles, right? Like the Great Moderation was more euphoric with regards to firms, and here after the financial crisis, for example, sentiments towards the financial sector sort of collapsed. Yeah, so these are some preliminary just observations that we can make with our model. Just a quick yeah, I hope I still have the time, otherwise interrupt me. So we also then decided to run a quick econometric application. Great. So what did we want to do here? We again, right, observed that most central banks do not follow a specific policy rule, but manage expectations through forward guidance, where communication plays an essential part. So one simple way of just testing the efficiency of forward guidance is to compare central bank communications to the future level of different interest rates, which is what we did. So this question is somehow also not very new. There have been studies on this, for example, by Morris and Shin, where they asked, like, do communications drive interest rates, or do interest rates drive communications? And with reference to Paul Samuelson, they compared this circularity with the reactions of a monkey looking in a mirror, not knowing that it is itself. So what did we do to test this? We again used our data set of speeches from the Fed, which includes the speeches of the Board of Governors and also those of the regional bank presidents. So in order to test the different impact on interest rates that are most likely to affect different economic agents, such as consumer loans, corporate bonds, interbank rate, and the government bonds. And to quantify the audience and tone of each communication, we use our model. We only count results for sentences with an accuracy threshold of 70% for the audience classifier and 80% for the sentiment classifier, just to be sure that the sentences are correctly classified. And then we aggregated the data by quarter. And then we just run a simple bar model here on this question, or on this equation with the sentiment scores, or the audience distinguished sentiment scores on the one end and the interest rates on the other. And we find that when the Fed speaks ex post about interest rates, so with some lags, the correlation is actually negative. So that means that, for example, here, if consumer loans rise, the central bank will speak negatively, but if consumer loans fall, they will speak positively, which holds for all of the equations, so all of the communications, except for the government. Yeah, so the government, we didn't find any evidence. However, when the Fed speaks ex ante about interest rates, the correlation is positive. So, for example, this means that when the Fed speaks positively, the consumer loan rates rise, and if the Fed speaks negatively, they will fall, which again surprisingly holds for the financial sector, households, and firms, but not for the government. So what can we conclude from this with regards to this monkey in the mirror question? So in a way, if we take these observations together, we can tentatively conclude that central bank communications steer upswings and dampen downswings. So communications may then be considered to anticipate the credit and business cycles, and interest rates in turn counteract the communication. So this is almost a bit too efficient, so we need to study it further. But it's an interesting, I think, preliminary finding here with regards to the application of our model. We also tested for granular causality and observed that communications to firms in the financial sector on the district level granular cause changes in corporate bonds and interbank rates, whereas interbank rates granular cause board member and district speeches to the financial sector, and consumer rates granular cause district member speeches. And so again, here the interaction seems to go both ways. So this was just one application. There are many different things that can be done. I think this whole field of audience distinction is really kind of like an open field, right? Who listens, what audience is impacted the most by central bank communications. Then there's the issue of transparency. Is communication to ordinary citizens effective or a failed endeavor? This we think is especially interesting with regards to recent endeavors in central banking to be more open towards the public, be it in discussions on central bank digital currencies, or just also by making communications more accessible. So the Kincaid scores, for example, I was talking about earlier, have become lower in recent years. Also, the audience specificity may help to actually distinctions or analyses on the micro level. So once we actually have communications that talk only to firms, we can actually study more closely which kind of firms are listening, which kind of firms are impacted by communications that are directed towards them. Then we can reap the fruits of more granular data. So we could, for example, study if financial markets will actually listen to the entire sentence, or if reactions are already happening mid-speech, things like this. More high frequency data here could be interesting. We can also look at individual central bankers' policy stance, which also was more difficult to do before because we just didn't have enough data points. So maybe, I can show this. We did this here for fun, just to plotting the sentiment for Richard Fisher, who's the the Fed president of the district bank in Dallas, and also labeling his speeches. We really kind of see that Richard Fisher talks very highly about firms, especially when they are in Texas, and is also more positive towards households, whereas Wall Street and East Coast seems to be more in the negative here, and the government, of course. So these kind of things are also possible now to explore because we have more granularity in our data. And then, the translatability issues, looking for similarity scores and so on, is also easier now. We can, for example, study how communications are reflected in the press, if they overlap, if they contradict, and so on. And then there's the field of interpretability. So for example, how do central bankers differ in communication style? Are sentences with different sentiments also different in syntax? Again, here the sort of coded language or Fed speak could be interesting to pursue further. And lastly, there's the issue of updates. So of course, language change, language is not stationary, it evolves. So we will probably need to think about retraining the model, updating it every other year, or I don't know with what kind of frequency, but this is important. Yeah, so our model will be released soon on GitHub and Hugging Face. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, Maritz and Vincent, I have a lot of comments, okay, like an incredible number of comments. And these comments are more like kind of requests for work kind of comments, okay? In the sense that it's kind of directed also to kind of the audiences that we care about, which are central banks practicing monetary policy, trying to be the best in the world, and so on. And so what I think would be really helpful here, okay, would be to tie it in a little bit more to the literature of developing monetary policy frameworks, okay? So I just want to give you like one little example, okay, but I have hundreds of them, okay, because I used to watch financial markets every day at the IMF, and I was in charge of monitoring the real economy and of course talking about those high frequency data and what was going on in financial markets and so on. So I want to tell you that I believe that this research, this kind of research, the idea of combining narratives and language with data, the way that we normally think about it, is the future. So I just want to give you like one, maybe two examples, okay? But one is the work by Andy Levin and co-authors, okay, where they looked at daily data. Effectively, they use data from the index bond market. And so the idea is that from data from the index bond market, can you hear me okay? Am I okay? Can you hear me? Because I've been having problems with my computer today.
Perfectly fine.
You hear me? Okay. Sorry, I've been having all kinds of problems. I'm on my second computer today. And we've just been having incredible problems in Portugal because all these people are coming on holidays and it's interfering with my Wi-Fi and all kinds of crazy stuff. Okay, but this is the paper, okay? It compares the response of the basically the term structure, okay, to news that should affect short-term inflation expectations. Okay, so the idea is that when your country is anchored, okay, and there's news that that drives short-term inflation expectations up, you don't want long-term inflation expectations to go up. Okay, and so what Andy Levin and co-authors found, pretty intensive numerical stuff back then. Today it was probably not very difficult, but they looked at all the information that hit, like all the data, what I mean by information. So I don't know, 160 time series in the US, for example, that kind of data, the high frequency data that we all look at and stuff. And they found that the data that should drive short-term inflation expectations up in the US drove long-term inflation expectations up. And the idea is that that was bad news because when you compared them to the responses in the seasoned inflation targeting countries, that long-term inflation expectations were, not dependent on the same news that drove short-term inflation expectations. And so I just think that, like, the way that your research is going right now, it's kind of like very general and so on. And so it'd be really cool to kind of apply it in cases where we kind of think we know what the answer is, right? So you could say, okay, they looked at the 160 time series or whatever. What we're going to look at is also the responses in the market. How did they interpret the data? What was, what was their interpretation? How can we add then and look at the difference between communications in those seasoned inflation targeting central banks where things were anchored, and how was the communication different by the Fed? And the answer is, well, first of all, the Fed didn't have a long-term numerical objective. Okay, so there's obviously uncertainty about that. So that's pretty obvious. But I have literally about 999 examples that I could just list off one by one, where if you did this research, okay, and brought in the language perspective where you kind of think, some idea what the answer might be and kind of what makes sense, you'll be able to better quantify what you mean by the things that you're trying to measure and stuff. The other example that I think is really cool is watching the Japanese yen and the Canadian dollar. Okay, like it's absolutely amazing because when there's bad information that drives the stock exchange down in Canada, chances are the exchange rate will depreciate because they anticipate that the central bank will respond to that information in the future, which means that the market interest rates fall, the exchange rate depreciates on bad economic news. Amusingly, in Japan, okay, because they're at the effective lower bound when there's news, bad economic news that drives the stock market down, the yen appreciates. Okay, so these are so like teasing out some analytics that would generate that result, and then showing that people, reduced form correlations in the data, that there are these beliefs that get factored into financial markets and rules of thumb and stuff like that. They're not stable over time. Obviously, if you change Japan's monetary policy regime and make it stable, when they're no longer at the effective lower bound, presumably it will become like Canada, where the exchange rate starts acting as a shock absorber in the system, as opposed to a shock amplifier, because perceptions of markets are that they're not going to respond sufficiently aggressively. Okay, so that's I think basically if you come up with more kind of examples like that are kind of intelligible to the audience, like intelligence.
Yeah, I think the applications are like literally limitless. But what I think, or we hope at least, is better possible now is that when you want to study the effects of, or the reactions, for example, in your first in the paper by Andy Levin, that when you want to use these communications to study market reactions, at least now you can be fairly sure that these communications you have found using our model are actually addressed to the markets, and there's no noise in there because the central banker at the same time also speaks to firms or oil companies in Texas, So this, I think, was sort of our first primer, really, which we really feel is fundamental to then pursue whatever kind of research you want. If you can also study, I don't know, fiscal dominance, looking at government communications and so on, right? So this really then depends on personal research preferences, I think. But yeah, of course, it would be cool to look more deeply into the market reactions.
Other questions before we move, please? That was a very specific kind of question, but there are other people on the call that aren't as into monetary policy communications and so on. But Larry, Bob, Narek, anybody before we move on to we're just going to be doing like a 15-minute submission of not the Tealbook, and I'm sure Moritz and Vincent, they'll be able to run hikes words through their machine and tell us whether or not there will be positive sentiment or negative sentiment from which would be really cool. We'd like to, you know, we'd like to try that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So any other? Okay. So Heike, maybe you can please do your presentation. Moritz and Vincent, in case you're wondering, we're in the process of developing what we think is Mark II, okay, which is getting rid of baseline forecasts and focusing more on what we call the risk management approach, okay? In New Zealand, they call it the least regrets policies and so on. And this will actually complicate our communications in the sense that moving away from baselines is more complicated. But at the very same time, in places like Armenia, it actually simplifies communication in the sense that the reality is that things are moving very, very quickly, and couching things in terms of a baseline, where the baseline is moving all over the place, doesn't make communication easier, because the reality is there is that uncertainty, and we have to design a framework that, you know, is consistent with that reality and so on. And so we've got these submissions to the governor's challenge that most of them are going to be from Armenia, where they have this, they live in this world of uncertainty. And then there's still the New Zealand example, where they still use baseline forecasts to communicate, but they also act in a consensus-seeking way. So they think about the board coming up with a baseline and risk assessments and so on, and they could choose as a board to do anything that they want if they truly wanted to communicate policies of least regrets or the prudent risk management approach. But the convention is to use baseline and risk assessment. So Evie Trong, who's the manager of the forecasting and modeling system in New Zealand, did a submission last week, okay, that is based on the institutional framework of New Zealand. Edgar did one last week that was based on the institutional framework of the Central Bank of Armenia. And now Heike will do another version of the Armenian institutional framework. Okay, so Heike, can you please carry on with your presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Doug, for introduction. And thanks, Maurice, for a very interesting presentation. I guess my presentation would be less interesting compared to yours, but I just would like to use this opportunity for talking about one of these projects that we are working at the Global Forecasting School. So we regularly produce this document, which we call Not the Fed Tealbook. So basically, as Doug says, it's kind of a playground for us for simulating our new monetary policy framework, which we call Mark II, FPAS Mark II framework, where we try to explicitly incorporate this risk management approach to monetary policy making. And so in terms of setting your expectations, it's not kind of a professional version of inflation report, but rather it's done with very limited resources and very tight deadlines. So basically just to point or draw out some key issues that are relevant for policy makers now. So in our YouTube channel, the Better Policy Projects YouTube channel, there are lots of videos covering the FPAS Mark II framework in details. But just the key things that Doug also mentioned is that it's a kind of departure from consensus-seeking baseline approach of doing monetary policy, where all the discussions are centered around a single line, which is the baseline. But rather we use the case type of scenarios for illustrating the uncertainty, to pin down the important nonlinearities in the economy that have policy implications, and also to stress the individual accountability of board members. So what we mean by case type of scenarios, these are illustrative scenarios where the policy rate path, let's say if we are talking about like case A type of scenarios, so it kind of illustrates the developments in the economy where policy rate path is significantly higher than what is priced in the markets in order to take control over inflation and achieve basic policy objectives. So you can think of this type of scenarios as situations where there is excessive demand in the economy, or contractionary supply shocks where the inflationary risks are skewed again on the upside. So during our previous seminars, Edgar and Evi did their versions of Not the Fed Tealbook, basically also illustrating the differences in the institutional frameworks. And what I'm going to do today is just to focus on case B type of scenarios, or draw some main issues or risks that require lower interest rate path compared to what is priced in the markets. Basically to brief the key things that we have discussed so far during our meetings. So in terms of thinking about this case B type of scenarios, I think the real estate market in China is kind of a significant headwind. So all these cultural things of keeping the assets in houses in China skyrocketed the house prices there, and for a median like Chinese to buy a house, it's kind of a luxury thing. So this graph illustrates that point, I think, quite well. So basically the numbers shows how many years of disposable income is needed to for the house in many major cities around the world. So for example, in New York it's 10 years, in Paris 20 years, and in most of like Chinese cities it's around 40 to 50 years. So this real estate sector was kind of a significant driver of economic growth in China, and for the last 2-3 years it's in a significant trouble, and now the momentum has weakened again. So in terms of thinking about this case B type of risks or scenarios, I think this is a relevant issue given the role of China in the global economy, in terms of the external demand for US, and in terms of like the demand for commodities, and given the role of this sector in Chinese economy, so all these direct and indirect effects related to the real estate sector, I think accounts almost like 30% of Chinese GDP. So it's kind of a big risk now, and kind of relevant issue to think about, and relevant ingredient for thinking about case B type of scenarios. So in order to like understand what would look like case A and case B type of scenarios in terms of the policy rate path, I think it's important to understand what are markets pricing right now. So at the latest meeting, FOMC members voted to keep the policy rate unchanged. However, if you look at the dot plots, the projections via the dot plots, it seems that the median committee member now anticipates that 2 more interest rate hikes are appropriate for taking control over inflation and achieving like policy objectives. And if you look at the market expectations, they adjusted accordingly after the meeting, and they are like close to the median market, median committee member expectations, but they are still underpriced. So if you were looking at the market expectations during the year, there was some disconnect between what the policymakers were signaling about the strength of the economy, about the policy rate, and what markets were expecting. So the markets were significantly underpricing the interest rate hikes, and during the previous month, if you look at the market expectations, they were actually expecting interest rate cuts during the year, while the dot plot suggests that there is no going to be rate cuts during the year. Now it kind of the market expectations adjusted somewhat, but I think they are still somewhat underpriced. And in this type of environment where markets are somewhat optimistic on interest rates, I think it's relatively straightforward to think about like case A type of scenarios where the policy rate path is going to be significantly higher than what markets are pricing. Well, because the economy is still quite strong. So if you look at the broad number of indicators on the labor market, there is an indication that labor market is quite strong. For the latest month, there are some signals of weakening, but these signals are mixed. So, for example, unemployment rate increased quite a bit during May, from 3.4 to 3.7, which is an indication of weakening the momentum in the labor market. But if you look at the payroll employment, which is based on a wider, larger survey and generally considered a more trustworthy indicator. So there is an indication that employment is growing still with a strong pace. And so that I mean that there is no clear indication that labor market is cooling down, and signals are mixed. So in general, it's still quite strong. And if you look at the GDP growth, like according to some measures, like the expectation is that it's still going to grow above the what the productive capacities are allowing. So in the sense that the economy is still operating under the excess demand and inflationary pressures are accumulating. And if you look at the decomposition of different components that contribute to GDP, besides some volatility in the inventories, I think the main driver still is the consumption, which is still quite strong and is partly driven by these excess savings that were accumulated during the pandemic era and after that. So I mean, in this type of situations, it's relatively straightforward to think about case A type of situations where policy rate needs to be higher, what markets are pricing. And if you think about case B type of scenarios, there is sort of indication that you need to think about some sort of recessions or financial crisis in order to have a lower interest rate path compared to what markets are pricing. So related to the financial markets, I think if you look at the financial markets, there is an indication that there is some sort of disconnect between what financial markets are pricing and in general the strength of the economy that we are observing. So if you look at the yield curve or the slope of the yield curve, it hits the deepest inversion since the 1980s. So basically the yield curve is screaming about recession. And if you look at the bank lending tightening conditions, again there is indication that the banks are there is some pessimism on these loan officers regarding the economic outlook, and the banking system is still under the stress after the bank runs in May. Everybody is talking like about the financial stability issues, about the trade-offs between price stability and financial stability. And like general mindset is that the financial stability issues should be addressed with different or distinct tools than what are used for monetary policy purposes. But there are important macro financial linkages and non-linearities and uncertainties in the transmission mechanism that brings on the table this case B type of discussions that we are constantly talking during our weekly seminars. So one like important uncertainty in non-linearity related to this macro financial linkages and related to this transmission mechanism, I think is based on the endogenous money creation process. So this is usually neglected in standard textbooks, and the usual way that textbook describe the money creation process is the money multiplier approach or the loanable funds model. But basically, the money creation process is endogenous inside the banking system, and money or purchasing power is created at the moment when banks grant a loan to households and to businesses. And the idea is that the pessimism or optimism of these loan officers, or in general the consumers and businesses, will affect this endogenous money creation or money destruction process. So if you look at this measure of bank lending tightening conditions, it basically around 40 to 50%, meaning that almost half of the banks now are tightening their lending conditions, which is going to weigh on the economic growth, like over the year or over the next quarters. And we, during the previous seminar, we showed some illustrative simulations related to this scenario, where we incorporate this BLT into our standard core projection models, and illustrated that how this BLT, like the tightening conditions in the banking sector, will have an effect on the economic growth in the future, which can basically serve as an input for thinking about like case B type of scenarios. And the other thing that we also discussed during our weekly meetings is related to the potential asset price bubble. Basically, if you look at the household balance sheet after the COVID crisis, the increase is very enormous in household assets. So it almost amounts 43 trillion US dollars, which is, to my opinion, is mostly attributed to fiscal and monetary expansion after the COVID crisis. So all these unconventional measures were like unprecedented, where the real rates on 10-year government bonds went to negative territories, and like the 30-year mortgage rates went below 3%. So all these measures like increased asset prices significantly. And what if there is a bubble in these asset prices, and like households use this assets as a collateral for funding their future consumption? And what if they start to consume out of this bubble? So I think it's going to create significant risks in the financial system once like the things adjust downward and people realize that their wealth is not worth as much as they consider. So this is like going to create or risks or for a financial crisis that could be large, even larger than the global financial crisis. So just to imagine how big of a number we are talking about, so this 43 trillion US dollars, it's almost double size of US GDP in 2019. So we are talking about a very big potential asset price bubble that can result in unexpected recessions, like looking forward in the next upcoming years. So basically, these are some ideas that we discussed during our meetings related to case type of scenarios. And thanks for your attention. If you have any questions, you are welcome.
So Moritz and Vincent, okay. Are you here, Vincent and Moritz? I was just thinking, listening to Hike talk about this asset price bubble, and just was wondering how much positive sentiment was there day by day as this $43 trillion built up? Because when I listened to Bloomberg, okay, what I see is people talking about sentiment, and so on, but nobody seems to put anything into perspective. Okay, like asking what is maybe really going on here. And so, Moritz and Vincent, it'd be really good because if people are just potentially manipulated by words, okay, where people have confidence that, you know, the financial system is okay, and you let a financial bubble develop on this magnitude, okay. So as I understood it, Heike, you have two concerns. One is it going to be reflected in consumption? But I would say an even more important concern, because typically when it is reflected in consumption, it's also reflected in housing. In other words, when people are wealthier, they buy more housing, and when they buy more housing, they take on more debt. And so I think if you were thinking about the risks, we still don't have the combination of a massive asset price bubble and excessive credit expansion. But I think what you're saying is that if this bubble were to continue and people were to treat it like it wasn't a bubble, in the sense that it was it affected people's behavior to take on debt, and if our modern financial system said that's okay, there's positive sentiment, everybody's comfortable and stuff, and so Moritz and Vincent, I'm just curious, when you think about this story, the lead up to financial crises obviously is a sequence of people have lots of positive sentiment, right? For a global financial crisis, you know, things like risky spreads are usually at all-time lows, and so on. So maybe Moritz and Vincent, do you have any reactions about how you might use that research to think about these kind of risks? But anybody else have any questions for Heike?
Yeah. Well, if we look at our data we presented earlier, then at least for the last, basically when, like in the mid 2010s, all sentiments went up, although they were still in the negative. So, right, so on average, the sentiment is negative, but the degree of negativity sort of is, and it's still going up, especially towards the financial sector and the government, which are, I guess, responsible for transmitting these kind of loans then, or policies. However, so we see that in the last 2 years, the sentiment towards firms and households is going down. So
Okay. Good.
There are two sort of different sentiments there, right? From the real economy, let's say, it's fairly negative, and the financial sector and government, it's going up. Yeah.
I see. Vincent, you've been quiet. Maybe we can give Vincent the last word.
What Moritz said, it's really interesting to see the distinction between the real economy and the financial sector and the government. And just looking at it right now, you see the sentiment towards the real economy track with the business cycle. And like mid 2010s, when recovery started happening, sentiment went up. And I'm curious to see how we might apply the two bubbles. Because we saw before the 2008 crash, there was in a certain sense like euphoria like there never was before. And if just being overly naive, only talking positively towards one group could be indicative of bubbles.
Okay, good. Anyone else have any questions for Heike or Vincent or Moritz? Any comments?
We have a question in chat. Yep. Salam, right question.
Please go ahead, Salam.
What are the key indicators to determine if we are in an asset price bubble? So I think there are no like precise ways of estimating how much of the asset price increases is a bubble or how much is driven with the fundamentals, but just based on observations on different things that we observe in the economy, like obviously economy is operating above its potential for a long period of time. That's why we are seeing these inflationary pressures. And to me, like it's obvious that these fiscal and monetary policy measures like created some room for increased these asset prices above their fundamentals that they will be going without this kind of measures. So yeah, we are just pointing out some issues that are relevant at this stage, and maybe this can maybe we can dig deeper to determine how much of this asset price bubble is really bubble, how much is driven by fundamentals. But in general, I think there is an asset price bubble. How much is it? I don't know.
I will, so let me give you my answer, okay? So the empirical literature, my summary of it is that the combinations of excessive credit expansions and asset price bubbles in housing, okay, and this is the critical thing, is that in the econometrics, why is it house prices matter so much? Why isn't it equity prices? So right now, the story that Heike was telling was equity prices that clearly are on Mars, in the sense that we had this, if you didn't think that there was a bubble before COVID, okay, if you thought everything was consistent with the fundamentals, COVID comes along, you produce less output, okay? And so asset prices, which are supposed to be the expected discounted value of output, they go down, right? Because initially they fell actually in terms of assets by $6 trillion in the first quarter of 2020. But then they increase by $43 trillion. Okay, well, that is the denominator in the discounting formula. When you drive the real interest rate down to zero and negative, that's what should happen. And if people underprice the risk of interest rates, which of course they did, that shows up in a kind of bubble that's simply because people got it wrong, okay? And they might get it wrong in the future. So we haven't yet seen, from the perspective of the empirical evidence, that we have both the combination of an excessive credit expansion and asset price bubble in housing, okay? Now in China, the story is different because when does the bubble finally end, like it did in the global financial crisis? When the price of houses gets so high that the young people coming in that are forming households, when they simply can't afford to buy the houses from the old people, I look at that. So that makes me worry. And when I think of China, that would make me worry. When I look at the US, I would say it's just in equity prices right now. The empirical evidence doesn't suggest very strongly that bad things are going to happen just because it's in equity prices. But if it were to be consumed, okay, or if people went to the bank because there was positive sentiment and bankers had positive sentiment, if they gave loans to people, mortgages, it could get transformed so that 4 or 5 years from now, we might have that dangerous combination from the perspective of the empirical evidence. Now, I think looking at equity prices, if equity prices were to, fall 20, 30, 40%, may be correct, maybe that would be okay, or maybe that might result in lower confidence and lower consumption and so on. So one can think of various stories there about how any shock right now could potentially result in some financial fragility simply because people haven't priced in these things? Well, it seems to be priced in the bond market in the sense that how do you rationalize interest rates, the term structure being so low? And one way to rationalize it, there's just some probability that something bad might happen. Nobody knows what it is, but bond market seems to be concerned. So that is not a very concrete answer, Salim. And I don't think the answer will ever be concrete because it's sort of the nature of dealing with modern financial systems. The instabilities manifest themselves differently. We regulate something, forget something, and then we learn about what the consequences of financial ingenuity have been to get around the problems that we're trying to solve with regulation. So I think it's just the nature. But right now, the evidence is house prices and excessive credit expansions. Those are the best leading indicators of the probability of a crisis. When it actually happens, look at bank lending tightening, look at risky spreads. Before the Lehman event in September 15th of 2008, the Fed Senior Loan Officer Survey was above 80. So look at Hike's chart. That indicator, once it's on you, is a pretty reliable indicator. Right now, it's only around 40 and would indicate that maybe a modest recession is around the corner. Okay, so Bob, you're back.
I've been here all along.
Oh, you've been all along. Maybe I thought you were gone, but maybe you could offer a few words of wisdom for Hike and Moritz and Vincent.
Well, I mean, the old saying about bubbles is you can never know you're in them until they're over. Because, I mean, sometimes good things happen. I mean, it's hard to say as an economist because, the dismal profession and all that, but dismal science and so forth. But, sometimes good things happen and it's hard to separate out some good things from bubbles. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be worried about, you should be worried about, especially central banks should be worried about bubbles. If things go good, and central banks don't have anything to worry about. If things go bad, central banks suddenly have everything to worry about. So they should concentrate on when things are going to go bad. It's just the risk aversion idea, no question about that. I have a whole lot of questions about the, but I know about the learning model, the large language model issue. I mean, let me just mention one. I mean, because it was highlighted in the thing, this separation of statements into different audience groups. So some are directed to, I doubt this is true, that central banks direct these things to different groups very much. A good example is, the example it's used about labor markets. I mean, you could say that when a central banker says, well, labor markets are improving, that's a positive, by which I mean labor markets are improving, unemployment's going down, for example, or hiring is going up. One interpretation of that is it's a positive statement to households. Another one is it's a negative statement because they're signaling that they're going to have to raise interest rates. And I think it's hard to distinguish between those two things. And it might be that when they say it in one context, they mean one thing, and the exact same words in another context means something else. It depends on whether, in some sense, it depends on whether inflation is rising or not. If they're worried about inflation and they say something like that, it's a negative sign. It means they're going to raise interest rates. If, on the other hand, everything's going fine and inflation's low and stuff like that, like, for example, 5 years ago, then it's a positive sign. They don't have to raise interest rates. And so there's, I think that classification is likely to be very fragile, is my point. In particular, that would be one that was my biggest sort of concern about that. But you should ask, is Larry here? I mean, Larry would know.
Yeah, maybe we want to reply. No, maybe Vincent, you want to reply, or should I reply?
Is Larry here? Because he's been recently on the other side of this communication, and he might have insight under whether you should ask central bankers about this.
I think you definitely have a point, but there are 2 points here, right? One is like about the general interpretation visibility of communication. So when the central banker says something, it could mean anything. And one problem in this whole central bank communications paradigm is that right, that the communications are almost willingly made opaque or
certainly true.
difficult to understand.
No doubt about that.
Exactly. So, but once you get past that and you accept that, well, let's at least try to make sense of that nonsense, then you need to start somewhere. And we believe at least that, yeah, by taking more context into account, for example, by not only looking at the labor market is doing bad or by itself, but actually by looking at who in the sentence, what other things the central banker is talking about, we increase the likelihood of getting it right. So this is sort of the idea here. And of course, you can then say, generally, that doesn't solve the nonsense problem, but at least it solves the context problem a bit. And that's at least our stance here.
If I may add to that, I agree that like in the big speeches, perhaps not every sentence is targeted, but if we look through the data set, like every third speech is at some specific convention. There's often like bankers conferences. Sometimes it's like the conference for local firms in Texas. And so the system already helps detect that to know what audience they're talking to in that specific setting. And
does the system know that? Does the system know when you train the system? Does it know what the conference is about or not?
Not directly through the title of the conference, but through the language used. Like if you speak to a bankers conference,
yeah, but that's sort of circular.
Use the vocabulary.
Well, that's a bit circular, though. That kind of reasoning, right? I mean, sure. So you could turn the model around and say, well, supposing I wanted to infer what the conference was, you could use your model based on the language to try and infer. You should try this. Use your language in the model and try to infer the nature of the conference from that. See if that. I mean, that's a little bit of a test about how much it's actually picking that up. It might work. I mean, I don't have any. I have no reason to think it wouldn't work. But you know, it'd be an interesting thing to know. Or you could tell the model what the conference is and let it use that information. That'd be a good idea too. It seems to me, because you're right. If some guy, that guy in Texas, you kept Fisher, you know, who talks to businessmen in Texas. Well, you know, it's probably the case that if he's talking to businessmen in Texas, he's talking to businessmen in Texas. And if the model knew that, it could presumably improve its accuracy or whatever the metric is that's interested in.
But maybe it does. That's kind of another problem of these kind of models. You know, that there are billions of variables it takes into account, and we don't really know precisely which one. So yeah, one way of going about it would be actually to test it. You know, like by knowing, okay, here we have a lot of business conventions, here we have financial actors, and here we have, I mean, yeah, like Powell talking to a kindergarten or whatever. So this could be done.
Yeah, no, it's, you know, but anyway, that was my big. Otherwise, I didn't. I mean, in terms of the audience, in terms of the nature, you know, you had that pie chart about. They talked about it's central banks talked about themselves. They talked about financial markets. Didn't talk much about government. I mean, I found that, you know, to me, that sounded very reasonable. In fact, I was surprised they didn't talk to themselves and to financial markets more than you find. I was surprised they talked about government almost 10% of the time, because usually central banks don't want to talk about the government because they're afraid the government's going to start talking about the central bank.
Yeah, good point.
Otherwise, I found it sort of that breakdown I didn't find very surprising, that they mostly talk to financial markets and about themselves. I found that quite a reasonable result, and good for the model. I mean, it's,
Okay, so very stimulating. So thanks, Moritz and Heike and Vincent and Bob and Salem for their interventions. And so thanks a lot. We'll be in touch. I have actual questions. Some of the things I didn't completely understand. Okay, and so I'd just like to ask.
I have lots of those too. There's lots I didn't understand.
Because maybe for me you have to go, but I've been using ChatGPT, okay, not silently, and I think it's well, not in the way I'm trying to use it as a critical thinker, as a productivity tool, and I'm actually using it for teaching and stuff, right? And what I find is just absolutely amazing, because if you take a critical thinker and you give him ChatGPT, the way he can use it as a productivity tool is just incredible. Okay. Whereas if you put people that are more descriptive, people that, really want to get the sentence right. Okay. Like the words in the sentence as opposed to the meaning and the idea. If you give it to them, I see no product. First of all, they're very impressed by the output of ChatGPT, because it could produce something that is up to I don't know what standards, but standards for grammar and stuff like that, but terrible standards for ideas. Okay, but you give it to a critical thinker, and it just blows my mind, because they're using it to help them improve ideas. So what I'd recommend to people: complain to ChatGPT, like use your speech recognition software. It works amazingly well because it doesn't have to be very accurate. So when ChatGPT does something, say, "This is terrible. This is the worst thing I've ever written. You completely missed the idea that we were trying to get at here." And it seems to actually understand and learn from things that it does completely wrong. And so I'm interested, because you guys understand more about the language model that's behind this thing, but I think it's really cool. And so talking to you guys, I'm sure that you could inform us a lot more about what is under the hood, because it's a little obscure to me at this point, what the objectives are and what precisely we're trying to do with this stuff. Okay, but please, but thank you, and thanks, Heike, for a wonderful presentation as well, and thanks, Bob, always for the kind interventions. Okay, so
thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.